Good evening, everybody. It's Kate here from the Safeguarding Association, and tonight we're having our regular safeguarding briefing to look at some of the updates that have happened in the last few months. We've had quite a few of those, and to look at some of the issues arising out of that, as well as to think about some of the issues that are coming ahead over the coming months. If you are live on this webinar, welcome. You can chat to me using the chat facility. That's probably the best way to contact me, to leave a message, to leave a question. It'd be great when you come on, just say hello, tell me that you're there. And if you have any questions or comments about what we're talking about, then please feel free to use the chat box to leave those, and I'll be checking that regularly. Otherwise, there is a way to use question and answers if you want to do that, if that's easier for you. There is an ability to raise your hand, but let's not use that because that's really quite difficult to for me to spot and to keep an eye on. So use the chat box or use the Q&A box if you've got, excuse me, any questions, and please feel free to say hello if you're here, and let me know, I say in the comments, what you do and what some of the biggest challenges have been for you as we go through as well. So, oh, make me jump, something flying about around my middle. Let us start with two of the biggies in terms of updates in the child protection world. And the two biggies are the significant updates to keeping children safe in education and the updates to working together to safeguard children. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail with either of these particular updates. One, they are far too big to go into the details of now. There is a free group I've had open on Facebook since probably May, when we first started to get the drafts through, which will be open until the end of October, where you can watch the videos and to discover what the big changes were in relation to keeping children safe and working together. So that group is on Facebook and will be active until the end of October 2018. Members of the Safeguarding Association are also going to get separate training in relation to this as well. But those are the two biggies that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking around changes to child protection and changes to the guidance that we have. So let's just quickly look in turn at what each of those documents do. Well, keeping children safe in education, for me, is the go-to guide wherever you work in child protection. It is aimed at schools and colleges. That's its primary focus. That is the guidance, that's who it's there for. That's who is legally obliged to follow it. But it's well written, and it's really good to help those who work on the periphery to really get to grips with what's expected when it comes to child protection. So what's really clear from the Keeping Children Safe in Education documentation updates is this real feel, this principle, this overarching requirement that those of us who've been doing this for a long time know, but it's always good to get a reminder that absolutely everybody has a responsibility for safeguarding. It is not good enough to say that's the designated safeguarding lead or that's the welfare officer's job. No, everybody from the caretaker right the way through to the school head has a responsibility for child protection. And that's embedded in all of the updated guidance, right the way through working together as well. And the Keeping Children Safe really pulls that into being by making it a requirement that everybody in the whole school community must know how the referral process works and be able to make a referral. Previously, you'll remember that actually what they had to know was up to that point. It was the basic level. If we think in old levels, level 1, level 2, and then your designated safeguarding lead at level 3, What Keeping Children Safe in Education has effectively done is merge level 1 and 2. So everybody has to know how to start, how to spot abuse, how to make a written referral, all of that. That's all embedded within Keeping Children Safe in Education. And good, says I. I think that's a really good thing, that practitioners across the board have to be able to do that. No more can people say, that's not my responsibility, somebody else needs to do that. And I don't think anybody ever did it maliciously, but there was, and I'm well aware there were instances where certain members of the school community just didn't want to do anything. And let's think about a serious case review we had in the not too distant past, which was the tragic case of Daniel Pelker. And within that serious case review, and you remember Daniel Pelker was the young Polish boy who was effectively starved to death by his family and didn't speak the language at all when he was at school. And the school seemed to take parents' view on merit. There was no challenging, and there were lots of failings seen. However, when the serious case review was doing its research and its investigation, there were people within the school community who felt that something needed to be done, that maybe referrals should be pushed, that maybe something else should be happening for this young man. And nothing was. And so what now we see within Keeping Children Safe in Education is this requirement that everybody within the whole school community has the ability, has the knowledge and the skills to make a referral through to children's services. So there is no excuse now. If those situations are happening and nothing is going on, everybody should be able to make that referral through. Even if it's on an anonymised basis, everybody should know how to make that referral and how to push that through. The other, I suppose, not big change, but probably a more, it's weird when you see it in print, because I know lots of you have been doing this for a long time, but the real centralisation of the role of the designated safeguarding lead within the school community. And in fact, within the wider school community, because what Keeping Children Safe makes really clear is that the designated safeguarding lead is likely to have the best picture of any child's life that's known to them at any one time. And so I know from the people I talk to during safeguarding hour on a Sunday evening that coming back from the school holidays, they were having a number of referrals coming from third-party agencies. They knew they had other things to deal with. They were well aware that their role was certainly being placed in a more central position. Now, lots of people will have already been doing this, but that role is a really, really important one. It's absolutely vital to protecting a young person or child at school. So we have this whole school community that has to be aware of how to make a referral, making safeguarding everybody's responsibility. Designated safeguarding leads put in a really central position. And on top of all of that, we have this concept of contextual safeguarding. Again, not new, possibly worded differently. And those of you who are really on top of your game, who are really good at child protection work, will have been doing this for a long time. But it is causing some hiccups for people, and we'll be coming back to that a bit later on in tonight's webinar. So we have this issue of contextual safeguarding, and all that really is looking at what's happening in that child's life outside of your school gates. What is life like for them? What is going on? What is happening? And does that information, when you put it in with what you know is happening within the school grounds, mean that that child is at risk of harm? Are what you're seeing within the school grounds a reflection of what's happening at home or elsewhere, where the child is possibly at risk of significant harm, or is actually being caused significant harm at that moment in time. That's, in a nutshell, some of the updates to keeping children safe in education. But there is a biggie, and that biggie is the introduction of a new Part 5, which is all around child-on-child sexual violence and harassment. It is tragic that we have to think about this for children as young as primary school age. However, I know in my my other world that if I were to put my lawyer hat on, this sort of situation is arising on a much more regular basis than we would ever care to believe. In fact, just this afternoon, I sat and read safeguarding logs from a school and was utterly, utterly heartbroken at the signs this young person had been showing of sexualized behavior and potentially of sexual abuse taking place at home. And unfortunately, there was a lot of discord between what was written in the safeguarding logs and then the referrals that were made through to the multi-agency safeguarding hubs. And something definitely got lost in translation. But it's happening. My point here is, just because you work in a primary school doesn't mean this can't affect you. It absolutely can. I have seen some of the most awful things come out in relation to 5 and 6-year-olds, which are just absolutely horrendous. So it can happen. We can't think this is only something that will happen once they're in secondary school. The criminal age of responsibility is 10, but the guidance makes it clear that just because they're under the age of 10 doesn't mean it shouldn't be reported or shouldn't be dealt with, or certainly the police be made aware of the situation. Again, the Part 5 element is big. It's probably, if you're working with older children, you're probably well aware of it. You're probably aware of the Sexual Offences Act 2003, and we'll be looking at that in a moment. But be aware that it's there, and there is now an obligation on schools in relation to child-on-child sexual violence and sexual harassment. So keep that in mind. That's keeping children safe in education in an absolute nutshell. The other biggie is working together to safeguard children that has been released. And those of you who have been following the briefings or following my updates via email will know that in 2017 there was a big piece of legislation passed, which was the Children and Social Work Act 2017, which made provision for safeguarding partnerships. And these safeguarding partnerships were to replace local safeguarding children's boards. What we now have is the mechanism by which that will happen. So working together to safeguard children talks about how that will happen, what their role is, what they are to do, how they're going to be made up. And we also have transitional guidance that will fit in alongside that. So I'll talk about safeguarding partnerships in a bit more detail in a moment or so. But I just want to look at some of the other things that have happened in terms of working together to safeguard children. What we have is an extended list of organisations who now have formalised responsibilities for child protection. Lots of these organisations have probably had something in place around a child protection policy. However, I'm not clear, and certainly again from conversations I've had over on Twitter Hour and with my colleagues, I'm not clear how many organisations have really fully embraced the cultural aspect of making it safe to whistleblow, to share concerns, to really embed that culture of vigilance, that culture of being open to the possibility that something could happen where they are. The section I'm talking about is in chapter 2, and it's around those who have a requirement under section 11 of the Children Act. Now, lots of those organisations have had a responsibility for a long time. The 3 that come to mind that I think are possibly going to be greatly affected, or affected more greatly than others, are your sports clubs, your faith-based organisations, and your voluntary groups. Now, there is a list of documents that you need to have in order to comply with working together to safeguard children. Like I say, lots of organisations have had maybe a child protection policy, they've maybe had a safer recruitment process, but they may not have had a whistleblowing policy, they may not have had regular staff training in relation to this, in relation to safeguarding updates. They may not have had the ability to get support. They may not have had supervision when they've been dealing with some really difficult cases. Working together, like keeping children safe in education, really embeds this view that safeguarding is everybody's responsibility. And personally, I think what working together is doing is trying to close that gap that was there in relation to these, particularly these 3 areas, when we're looking at child protection. So yes, there will have been a welfare. So if you're within a league, a formal league structure that is affiliated to a governing body, you have probably had lots of this in place already. And I'm not really worried about those organisations. The ones that I think, and certainly that I'm hearing about, that are going to have the biggest issue because of what's going to need to be done, are those organisations where they're not necessarily affiliated to a governing body. They may be not a charity, they may be set up as a not-for-profit organisation, they may be set up as an extension of a company, as part of a giving back process. They may be a completely voluntary organisation that's run by way of committee and isn't registered as a charity, isn't registered as a anything particular, but has essentially just run itself as almost a partnership without any formalisation of the processes. If you're a registered charity, you've got lots of things you need to deal with. But those organisations that sit outside of that are the ones that are likely to have some difficulties in keeping this documentation together. It shouldn't be too onerous, but do take time to look at the chapter 2 of Working Together to Safeguard Children, to look at what it is you need to do. And it's right at the beginning of the chapter that sets out all the documents that you're going to need. So do take time to read that, work out what you have, work out what you need to have. And then in terms of the cultural aspects, and by that I mean this culture of vigilance, this ability to, this creating of an openness, of an awareness, which takes an entire community to build, but needs the backing of everybody to do so. That's going to take some time. That's not going to happen overnight if you don't have that in place already. But that shouldn't be a barrier to you trying to build that. And I don't want you to think, oh my Lord, I've got so much I need to do, we just can't possibly function. You can and you should. Because I know that for some children and young people, your organisation is possibly the only place outside of school they feel safe. In fact, your organisation may be the only place they feel included. I play softball, and our local, we're affiliated, we're part of a baseball club, and my husband plays for the baseball team. And we had a camera crew down to the field a few weeks ago, and there were a number of young people because there's a children's group that play, and they were asking the children what they thought and how they felt about playing. And one little girl said she loves playing because she's included. She doesn't get picked when she's at school. And I thought, that is really, really sad. That's really tragic that this little girl goes to an out of school club because she feels included, and she doesn't get that in school. Now, I'm not blaming anybody at school for that at all. My point is that for lots of young people, these out of school organisations are really a safe haven for them. And I would hate to think that requirements of having policies and procedures in place is going to exclude you from being able to do that. So to counter that, I'm currently working with an HR specialist in order to prepare a pack of documents that organisations can purchase, which are templates. So you do not need to worry about where you're going to find the time to get these written up. I can help you with the documents. You need to concentrate on the culture. And I think that's a fairly decent deal. Let me know in the comments whether you think that's a good deal or not. Okay, let's look back to safeguarding partnerships. The reason for safeguarding partnerships coming in is because when there was a consultation, and after lots of conversations, it was felt by a number of professionals that serious case reviews and local safeguarding children's boards were effectively pointing the finger at people when there'd been a child death or a serious injury. And that was seen as unhelpful. To some extent, I agree that if all we're doing is finger pointing, then we're not going to achieve anything. However, sometimes somebody is at fault, and we need to stop that happening. But we need to do it in a way that is educational, that is appropriate, and that doesn't prevent people from wanting to speak up in the future. That can be really difficult to manage. But serious case reviews are there for a good reason, and we need to do something different. I am, on a personal note, fed up of standing in training and talking about how we need to share information, how we need to make sure that what our concerns are shared appropriately and in a timely fashion with those that can do something about it. Every serious case review I have ever read has at least in one part commented on the lack of information sharing between key agencies. That we have to change. And so out of all of this, the need to feel, the need for there to be a change, the need to develop, the need to try and do things in a better way, safeguarding partnerships have been born. And safeguarding partnerships are replacing local safeguarding children's boards. They have to replace them by the 29th of June 2019. 2019. Crikey. And whilst there's going to be some overlap, the absolute last day for safeguarding partnerships to be in place fully is the 29th of September 2019. So what are safeguarding partnerships? Well, they're made up of three key partners. You have your local authority, you have your police force, and you have your CCG. They circle around the local authority. So they go by local authority area. The guidance makes it clear that it's well aware these two may overlap, but it goes by local authority area. It is then up to these individual partners here as to which authority, which force, which CCG takes the lead for that particular safeguarding partnership. Each of these will pay equally into the safeguarding partnership pot. So each of them, CCG, police, local authority, all pay equally into the safeguarding partnership pot. They all must decide, they must have somebody from each of the authorities who can bind that authority as part of the safeguarding partnership. I am concerned. I like the idea of safeguarding partnerships. Let's start there. I really like the idea of safeguarding partnerships. I like the idea that these three get to sit around a table on a very, very regular basis, and each of them has an equal part to play. So there's no passing off, or there should be no passing off from one to the other. I know that there are frustrations between each of those organisations, and I am hopeful that in local areas that can be alleviated by this really close working of these three organisations. What does concern me is something in relation to their funding. Now, I'm going to make an aside right now. So we have our safeguarding partnerships, they're here. What we are well aware of as practitioners is that the funding pot for all of the services that we had access to 10, 20, 30 years ago has all but dried up. In some areas, local safeguarding children's boards have been able to continue to put on training at low or no cost to those that work within that area. I'm also aware that in some areas, other partners, so private companies, have come in and have funded the ongoing training whether the LSCB hasn't been able to continue with it. But that's just one function. Each of these organisations has to put in equally. Well, we know that police forces don't generally have an awful lot of money to spare. We know that the NHS has little money to spare. And we also know that within local authorities, their budgets are being slashed massively. There was a report on the BBC that I shared with my mailing list last week around the cuts that are coming. So we've already had an awful lot of cuts to frontline services. What we're now being told by some authorities is that these funding cuts that are yet to come in are going to directly affect those within statutory services. So there was a good chunk, about a quarter of the number of people who replied to the survey in terms of authorities saying they were going to cut services to early years and early help. Of those that answered, 35% said they were going to make cuts to children's services. Now, that's just a small proportion of people, of local authorities, that actually responded to the survey that went out as part of this poll. I'm not a mathematician, and I've no intentions of ever trying to be one. But even for that small number that replied, which I think was about 12 authorities, that's a lot. To have a quarter of them make cuts to early years and early help, and to have 35% of those saying, they were going to make cuts to children's services. That is significant. And my real concern is, whilst funding isn't everything, we are rapidly losing all of these additional services that we used to have access to, that used to be able to help children. And they're having to be picked up by other organisations. But again, there's little funding there to deal with it. Safeguarding partnerships, like I say, I think are a really good idea. I think it's really crucial that these three work together. I'm keen to see how this is going to work in practice. I'm keen to see how it rolls out across the country. And I'm keen to see how different they are to local safeguarding children's boards. Speaking to former chairs of LSCBs, one of their concerns is this is simply a rebrand and nothing will change. And again, we will be left in a situation where, whilst they're meant to be partners, the local authority will be left taking the lead, and these two, whilst they will fund, will not do an awful lot. Whether that is true, I do not know. I rather suspect that if you talk to a CCG or you talk to a police force, their concerns will be similar, that they're being pulled into something that they have nor the time, the ability to staff or fund to a good enough level in order to make it work the way that we all hope it will. There will be discrepancies across the country as well. And one of the things Working Together to Safeguard Children has done is make it clear that we're going back to localised practices. Now, I see that on a day-to-day basis anyway. Doesn't matter where I call, doesn't matter where I'm working. I've worked in courts across the country, and every process is different. Even though it sets out in really clear legal processes what needs to happen, it always works slightly differently wherever you are. Imagine that on a much bigger scale. Now, I already know from talking to members of the Free Keeping Children Safe in Education Updates group, from talking to Safeguarding Association members as well, that there are differences, and quite significant differences, in the way referrals are made. Some referrals have to go through their multi-agency safeguarding hub. Others go through a duty team within the children's social care team that sits outside of MASH, the multi-agency safeguarding hub. I'm not sure how many more processes there are. I think there were at least 4 that were kind of the same, but equally they were all slightly different. There's a similar issue we know with thresholds. Threshold in one area can be wildly different to threshold in another area in terms of getting a referral through. This shouldn't be happening. We should know that making a referral in Truro is the same as making a referral up in Tyneside. It should not matter where we are. Those thresholds to say a child is at risk of significant harm, using that assessment criteria, should say and should pass that test wherever we are in the country. But it's never worked like that. There's always been a level of discrepancy. Part of that is because there's human nature. Part of that is because of the differing levels of service in terms of the abilities to resource services in different areas. My real fear is that we are moving back into a localised practice that 18 years ago we fought hard against, or certainly Lord Laming fought hard against in his report, because a little girl, Victoria Colombier, was killed. And one of those 108 recommendations was that we needed to move away from localised practice. And we seem to be taking a step back there. I will reserve judgment. Let's see how this works in the next year, 18 months. The next year is going to be a transitional phase in terms of local safeguarding children's boards, moving to safeguarding partnerships. What I would suggest is that you find out when there are updating meetings, whether there are updating talks happening, and you get yourself along to your local one. So you know what's going to change in your area. You know what's going to be on offer in your area, and you know who you need to contact in your area about the changes that are happening. And if you can, get involved. Let your voice be heard. If you are in agreement with something, then say so. If you are worried about something and you can see real practical concerns here, say something. Because it's only by saying something that we're going to be able to properly get this to work for us. So don't be afraid to go along to those meetings and have those conversations and find out how it's going to impact you and those that you protect on a daily basis. Okay, I'm going to come down a little off my soapbox because I feel I'm getting higher and higher on it. Two bits of guidance that I was pointed to today, actually. One is, and I've printed it and I've put it somewhere safe and I now can't find it. One is updated guidance to the Sexual Offences Act 2003. It's about 70 pages long, definitely bedtime reading. It works alongside part 5 of part 5 of Keeping Children Safe in Education to provide more guidance around what those offences are. So be aware of that, have a read of it. And the other one is a document that I was actually sent via text today. Technology is this document here. And it's Criminal Exploitation to Children and Vulnerable Adults, County Lines Guidance. County lines is one of those phrases that seems to be new, a bit like contextual safeguarding. It's been around for donkey's years, but we've just called it something a bit different. When we talk about county lines, what we're talking about here are particularly in relation to child sexual exploitation and gang violence. So thinking particularly, if you think of the East Kent area where you've got a number of ports, and what gangs are doing is using children and young people to effectively traffic imports of drugs and illegal substances from one area of the county to the other, and then getting them across county lines further up or further across the south coast. Happens in bigger areas as well. So it happens a lot in London. London's really good at working together because the boroughs are so tightly packed. Happens in areas like the Midlands, where you've got lots of county authorities, and then you've got city authorities as well. So there's lots of issues there where children are being asked, again, usually with gangs, to traffic drugs across from, for argument's sake, from Nottinghamshire to Leicestershire, or from Manchester through to the Liverpool area. That kind of thing is what we're talking about, but we're talking about it in respect of these children and young people are being coerced into doing that, whether or not they understand it, in much the same way we talk about child sexual exploitation. It's not a massive amount of guidance. It is the sum total of 7 pages, 8 pages long. There's a quite nice little flow chart in it. If I can pull it up, that gives you a good view of what's happening in terms of county lines there. It's not really good for me to show you, but it's worth having a look at, printing off and putting in your folder, so that you've got that and have a read of it. So that is essentially the key statutory updates that we have had in the last few months. Keeping Children Safe in Education came into play on the 3rd of September this year. No, it isn't, because actually there were 2 other biggies. If I'm going to be complete in this, I probably should be complete in this. And the 2 biggies we've had are, and I'm not swearing at you, I promise, is GDPR, 25th of May 2018, and also the Data Protection Act 2018 as well, which has come into force. Also, talking about information sharing earlier, what those documents say and what we have made abundantly clear within Keeping Children Safe and Working Together is that neither the Data Protection Act nor GDPR, but particularly the Data Protection Act, should be or is a bar to you sharing information about a child that is vulnerable. It does not stop you. It has never stopped you from sharing information in relation to a safeguarding concern. So safeguarding still trumps data protection. Child protection trumps data protection. That has not changed. We've got that abundantly clear. Child protection trumps data protection. Okay, let's now have a look at some of the issues that have arisen in the 3 weeks since Keeping Children Safe in Education came out. And there are a couple of things that have been pointed out to me that on the frontline practitioners are struggling with or are starting to see come out of the training they do with their staff. One of those is around multi-agency working. And in some areas, this hasn't really been going particularly well. There's still been some concerns around how multi-agency working should operate, around information being shared properly with social workers, with local authorities. For example, information, and I use this because it's an example that came up recently. For example, there was a case I was made aware of that the police had been called, had arrested, action was taken in relation to the young person, and then there were calls around whether or not that young person could go back into school and the risks around it because of the person that had been arrested. And the designated safeguarding lead was telling me how incredibly difficult it was to get anything concrete out of the police in terms of what was happening and how they could safety plan. It was over the summer holidays. They were struggling to get anything firm out of the local authority, out of the multi-agency hub, to find out what was going on. And they were involved because there was a summer school going on. And it ultimately ended up, everything was fine, thankfully, but this took days to get any information across to make sure that this young person was safe and was actually okay going home. Other issues I'm aware of, and I don't mean to be, this is going to feel like a get at the police, and it genuinely isn't. These are just a couple of examples that have arisen, but I can use them, and I'm well aware that police forces can turn around and say they've asked for information from local authorities and it's not been shared, information from health and it's not being shared. So we can interchange the names as we go through. I'm absolutely aware of that. The example I'm thinking of is police were asked to supply information about an incident which took place where there were threats to kill against the social worker. That investigation is ongoing. The child in question thankfully wasn't present, but for safeguarding reasons, trying to get information out of the police as to where they are with their investigation and being stonewalled effectively with, this is an ongoing investigation and we're not going to release it, has not been particularly helpful. But I'm aware, like I said, you can interchange that name, that the police force for the NHS, for the CCG, for the local authority, for any multitude of them. We still have a lot of work to do in terms of, I think, ultimately, properly trusting each other. If we really think about it, do we really trust that the person we're going to share, or the organisation we're going to share that information with, is going to manage it the way that it needs to be? So that's one thing. Hopefully we'll get a bit more steer with that when safeguarding partnerships are fully implemented, but I think it's an ongoing issue up and down the country. If that's your experience, please leave a comment below. Let me know. Leave it in the chat box, leave it in the comments. That would be really, really useful, to just so I can get a flavour of what's happening nationally. That would be really, really useful. I'm also aware that this issue of this idea of contextual safeguarding is causing a lot of anxiety. Like I said before, this is nothing new. It's all about looking at what's going on beyond the school gates. Or if you are working in a sports club, youth group, theatre company, what's happening in that young person's life outside of your four walls? Being professionally curious is what we call it. Are we being professionally curious enough, or are we quite happy to bury our heads in the sand and think, don't need to worry about that, I don't want to have to fill that form in? That sounds slightly flippant of me, and I don't mean it to sound quite as flippant as it came across, but I do think there are lots of circumstances where we would rather not know than actually raise our head above the parapet and maybe have to deal with it, particularly if it's something we're not comfortable dealing with, or something that we've not been happy to deal with. Remember, Safeguarding Association's here to help you. If it feels a bit icky or you're struggling with something, then we've got plenty of people here who can help, who can hold your hand whilst you make those inquiries, whilst you raise that professional curiosity. That's what we're here for. We're here to really help you get through that. Final issues are around designated safeguarding leads. So one of the issues arose over the summer holidays, which it didn't really make a great deal of difference this year because the updated guidance didn't come into play until the 3rd of September, but it will make a difference for all of the holidays from the 3rd of September. And the question was, does a designated safeguarding lead have to be on call all the time? Now, the guidance in Keeping Children Safe in Education talks about designated safeguarding leads or their deputies. The inference from that is that there's likely to be more than one person. Now, if you are working for an organisation that is substantially large and you are it, I would suggest that where possible, you look at getting some deputies trained, and they should be trained to the same level as you. So it's not a case of, oh, you just need to have your basic awareness. Remember, whole school community must be able to make a referral. They need to have the designated safeguarding lead training. But ultimately, the designated safeguarding lead is responsible for that, has overall responsibility for child protection. So do designated safeguarding leads need to be on call all the time? I think the short answer to that is, well, actually, I'm not sure there is a short answer to that. I think the answer to that is, if you have activities taking place on your school premises, then you should have somebody on call if they're not attending those events and your pupils are going to be present for that, for those activities. So if, for example, and let's use the summer holidays as an example because that's the biggest extended period we've got. If you are running summer schools, if you are running tutoring classes, if you're running activities, if you're allowing your premises to be used by other organisations, make sure that you are protecting yourself. And if you are going to have your pupils, your school is putting on events where your pupils are going to be over the summer holidays or over a holiday period, then I would suggest you probably, from a best practice point of view, I would suggest you do need to have somebody available in order to deal with it. And I would suggest you need to have somebody present at those events who is appropriately trained to deal with those safeguarding issues, whether that is a deputy or your designated safeguarding lead. But you do need to think about that. And I would take time over the coming weeks and months. October half term is around the corner. Think about what is happening in your school or organisation And what are some of the things you need to be aware of? Are you aware of what is happening on your premises? For example, sorry, I've got a little fly buzzing in my ear and it's driving me crazy. For example, I'm the independent chair of a safeguarding board of a large college group. And one of the things we were exploring before Christmas was what's happening before the summer holidays. What is actually happening over the summer? Do we know who's coming on site? Do we know whether pupils have got access to the site? Do we know if they're going to mix? Do we know if there's appropriate persons going to be there? Are the people coming appropriately trained? So we had all of this that we needed to consider to make sure that the organisation we were protecting was going to be safe as far as it possibly could be. So if you're a little village school, perhaps, then maybe that isn't such an issue. But maybe you rent it out, maybe you rent the school hall out for dance classes. Are they going to be continuing over the summer? Maybe you've got commercial activities going on. Again, it's all about that professional curiosity. Are you asking the right questions in order to get to the nub of the issue? And ultimately, it's a decision for you as to whether or not you have somebody on call or on site over the school holidays. So that really wasn't a short answer in any stretch or form. But I don't think it is a straightforward answer, if I'm absolutely honest. Finally, one question which came up a couple of days ago was, do designated safeguarding leads, there we go, teeth in, have to be teachers? Well, in keeping children safe in education, what the guidance says is the designated safeguarding lead has to be a member of the senior leadership team. Doesn't say they have to be a qualified teacher. And this sparked a really interesting conversation around whether or not designated safeguarding leads should actually be members of teaching staff, or whether they should have the space within the school day to deal with safeguarding issues rather than having to balance them with teaching issues. Again, this comes down to individual practices. It comes down to individual school and college preferences. A lot of it will come down to actual funding. Are you in a position, as your organisation, in a position to give you that role without teaching responsibility? But the ultimate answer, as we gleaned, was no, they don't have to be teachers, but they do have to be part of the senior leadership team. So something to think about over the coming months as to whether or not that's something you feel would be right for your school, for your organisation. Lots of updates. If you haven't read them, read them. If you haven't yet been on updating training around them, find some and go on it and make sure that you are appropriately trained and set up to deal with this. And if you want to get some of the get access to the community that we have on Facebook, the free Keeping Children Safe in Education updates group is going to be open until the end of next month. So that's October 2018. So get yourself across to Facebook, search for Keeping Children, I think it's KCSIE free updates. Have a search for that on Facebook. You'll find it. You have to answer 3 questions to be part of it, but get yourself across there if you want some free updates. If, however, you feel that you would prefer to have some more support from me, or to have the ability to ask questions of me on a more regular basis, or your peers, then do look at the Safeguarding Association. You can find that at www.safeguardingassociation.com, and I would love to welcome you as a member. Any questions, leave them in the comments below. Let me know what your experience is, and thank you very much for taking part in tonight's webinar.